How do we figure out what is a camera seeing? What are these differences in spectral quality? Well, this is sort of a smattering of what we've been working with over the last couple of years. You'll notice some of those Minoltas, the old Minoltas. The best thing there, if you have one, or one of the old Gossens, throw a garden party, dig a hole, bury them. They're about as useful as compost right now. They really do not provide you any data that you can actually use and act upon. The Sekonic C700, 800 series, even a 7000 series, they're getting to the right point with data that you can actually use as a cinematographer, but still not directly related to a camera. So it takes some experience, a little bit of testing to figure out, once you know the instrument, you start to understand how to work best with it. Various color rendering indexes, CRI, TLCI, SSI, and it goes on and on. So I'll talk about some of those and explain how they, how relevant they are to this. So the tools to measure light quality for cinema production, unfortunately, none of these handheld meters are really designed for our industry. They don't give us actionable data. So if I'm trying to correct a color problem, they won't really give me that data relative to the camera. The C700, 800 comes closest to it because they're using the average curves of an HDSLR. So it sort of gives you an idea of what an HDSLR may see, but still there are differences in HDSLRs. And there's a definite leap in difference between that and a cinema camera. CRI gets bantered around a lot. Now, at the ASC, we've started a solid-state lighting committee. And the goal there is to get a lot of manufacturers together and decide on how are we going to define light quality. And we've all agreed, along with the CIE and the IES, Illuminating Engineers Society, that we've got to stop using CRI. CRI is not a representation of what is a quality light for cinema. They don't even want to use it for the eye evaluation. So it's out. And in its place, they've created some other, another index. IES TM3018. Now here's an improvement on the 8 to 15 colors in CRI. It uses 99 colors. So that's an awful lot of colors to go through. And it gives you a number of indexes. I'll only talk about two of them. The Fidelity Index, it characterizes the average difference in color for the 99 CIE swatches that they've referenced to a given Kelvin or a reference. So this is a representation of one of our lights. It's a nice round circle. You can see it pretty closely follows the outside perimeter. They also have a Gamut Index that characterizes the average saturation level of a test source to a given Kelvin. So these are interesting numbers to have. Does it give me data that I can act upon? No, but it gives me an idea that I'm maybe deficient or I'm lacking a certain portion of the spectrum. Data scored from 0 to 100. And you can see sometimes even in the Gamut Index, it exceeds their dynamic. Again, these are mathematical equations, so you can have things that fall off the scale, and it's not at all unusual. TLCI, I think this is, it started off a little funky where they were doing it on Plumicon cameras using the average curve of a Plumicon camera from 1976. We are the 21st century after all. So now it's predicated on average response curves from CMOS sensors and CCDs. I think it's an interesting index to compare different manufacturers and see how close they get. They give you a nice little chart where you can subjectively see differences between a reference source, say tungsten, and this other artificial source. So it gives you something, but is it actionable? Can I use that data to actually correct something that I'm seeing? Doesn't really do it. This is interesting, SSI, Spectral Similarity Index. Now this was developed by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, again, growing out of the same frustration that a lot of us have had on how do we actually come up with an index that we can act upon. We need some decent information to work off of. So they said, okay, well, you know what? We're going to divorce it from your eye, from everything else. We're going to go to a theoretical. We're just going to compare spectrum to spectrum see what the difference is. So there are ways of using it that help, and there are other ways of using it that will completely mess you up. So I'll show you one of the ways that completely messes you up. So here's a curve. Well, first of all, I guess you recognize the nanometer wavelengths, 400 to 700, and that represents a tungsten light source, or rather, yeah, that's a tungsten light source. Now, if I overlay a sort of typical LED spectrum over top of it, you can see that it has various offsets to that ideal reference source. And so what they do is they said, okay, we're going to apply a mathematical value to those offsets, and then we're going to give you a score. We're going to give you a scale. And so 100%, 100 indicates a spectral match. And now these are their words, not mine. High values indicate predictable rendering by most cameras as well as quality of visual appearance. Low values may produce good colors with a particular camera, but not with others. Whoa, I'm standing on a set and I've just measured something. I'm going to go to the producer and say, well, it may work, it may not. Get that out of here. It's not going to work. So there's one way it might be more useful if you're trying to compare two LED sources, let's say. How closely matched are these? And then when you're trying to line up one manufacturer to another, that may play into it. But I don't necessarily need an SSI index to do that. I can use a spectrometer and overlay two spectrums, and I can see exactly how it breaks down. I mean, it's essentially what this does, except they're putting a numeric value to it. So that may be a way of using it. But that's about the only way I've figured out I can use it, but I still don't know what I need to do to try to correct or bring them closer together. So SSI does not relate to the spectral sensitivity of the camera. So you also may end up applying positive or negative values in an area where the camera is more or less not even sensitive to it. Again, no actionable data that I can clean up. And I think it's a project in development, and so we'll just keep watching it and see where it goes. But just to figure out if I were to use that today on the set, and I were to use these meters and the different indexes. So this is one of our freestyle spectrums. CRI would put me at a 97.2, TLCI at a 97, SSI 71, TM3018 high values again. So that's kind of what suggests to me I can't use that source on a set. Yet, it's one of the cleanest light sources on the market. Gives you absolutely fabulous skin tones. So this is where a well-intended index can actually go off course, because it does not take into account what the camera sees. And ultimately, as cinematographers, we use our eyes. You try to see, is this going to work for me? At the same time, you're hoping that the camera is going to see what the eye sees. But it's still ultimately, what does the camera see? And through experience, you get to a point where you know that the camera is going to see certain things and other things it may not see. But this is where I have my problem with SSI. So with this sort of as the landscape of what to do, we said the only way I'm going to get around trying to figure out any of this stuff is we've got to come up with our own spectrometer. So this is sort of my sandbox here. We have down in this lower quadrant here, it says raw scope. This is just capturing the spectrum of the light source that we're measuring. Then we calibrate it. The CIE color space chart gives us an XY position, and we see the little line is the Planckian curve that I described earlier. And you can see that, well, it appears to be on the Planckian. This is a good thing. And we're able to introduce different camera curves into the spectrometer. So CRI was a measure of how your eye perceives light, and you'd use the spectral response curve to generate the CRI values. Here we're generating values per camera based on their spectral response curves. So up there we see an Amira, a Mysterium, and a Panavision 8K Red. What I did is to give some sort of a general comparison index. I took the same methodology as CRI, but applied it to a Macbeth chart and basically averaged out the values. and came up with a relative index. So in this case, this same light source now sort of gives you an illustration of how the different cameras see it. So on the Alexa, it actually sees a nice full broader spectrum. On the other two cameras, both basically the same sensor, a 95. Not that that's a bad value. That's good. What it's pointing to, though, are these subtle differences. And these are sort of the subtle differences that you had in film. What's also interesting is right underneath the camera description, there are a number of rows of CCT. So CCT is actually what the spectrometer is reading. So on the instrument, it said 2700. It's 2659 was the actual reading off a spectrometer, and that's a scientific instrument. But what's interesting is how the camera actually sees it. So the Alexa sees it as 2718 Kelvin. The other one sees it as 2558 and 2391. So the cameras in and of themselves, you'd think that they would reproduce that Kelvin at the appropriate Kelvin, but they don't. So again, these are these little nuances and differences. So when you're trying to understand what's going on between light and camera, all these mathematical complexities start to show their differences. So again, but this is how we went about trying to understand it. And then last but not least is one row up there, which is important to us, and that is just how that color point on the Planckian, how does that embody itself in terms of a skin tone? Is it going to see a little green? Is it going to see a little magenta? And 0.12 would be equivalent to an eighth of a filter correction. So we can see from those numbers right there, it's what's called color correct. There's no way, there's nothing there to correct.